Thank you. Miguel, I used to think you were my good friend until you gave me this topic, which is a very difficult one. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here in Mexico again. Let me turn off my phone. So this is a very difficult topic. Here are my objectives. I will try to provide an overview of global trends in GI disorders. As I go along, I will emphasize differences in disease prevalence and presentation. I will also try to illustrate how regional variations could provide insights into pathophysiology. I will enumerate the challenges that we all face. Because of time, I must tell you this will be very selective. I have picked a few topics that I found interesting, and I will talk about those. We have to start, of course, with infectious diseases. And we have to remember that despite all of the advances in medicine, global mortality from diarrhea in children is still very high in many parts of the world, such as here in Africa and in India and Bangladesh. There is progress here, but this is still a major global issue. We also need to remember that acute gastroenteritis is mostly viral. In fact, around the world, most cases are viral. And even when we come to the United States, we have a significant burden of infectious diseases in gastroenterology, and in particular, foodborne illness. This has not gone away. And here you can see the seasonal variations in the occurrence of Campylobacter, Salmonella, Cryptosporidium, and Shigella. And you will notice that while Campylobacter peaks in the summer, Salmonella tends to peak a little bit later, but both are mostly in the summer months. I cannot speak to you today without referring to Clostridium difficile, which is an epidemic in the US and now is an epidemic throughout the world. And this is the recent data from the US showing the overall prevalence of Clostridium difficile, and you will notice that as you get older, the incidence increases dramatically. So the aging population takes the major burden of Clostridium difficile. But what is really new is that now in the US, at least 1/3 of cases shown here are acquired in the community, not in nursing homes, not in hospitals. And that's a major change. And I want to emphasize that. Helicobacter pylori is a global problem. And here you can see a map of the prevalence of Helicobacter throughout the world. The dark areas have the highest prevalence. And you can see that there are major differences in prevalence throughout the world. What is intriguing are the enigmas. And I'm referring to areas of the world where Helicobacter pylori infection is common or endemic, but gastric cancer is not common, such as parts of Africa or India. This is a very controversial topic. Some believe that it's simply an artifact of survival, that in these very poor countries, people don't live long enough to get gastric cancer. Others believe there's a true enigma. The solution to this is very important and has enormous implications for Helicobacter treatment. If we feel that everybody should be treated to prevent gastric cancer, we're talking about treating over 50% of the world's population. Implications for cost, antibiotic resistance, and will it even work to prevent cancer? But I want to show you one interesting study from Latin America, from Colombia, where they noticed that the same people, depending on where they lived, had very different rates of gastric cancer. They all had Helicobacter pylori, but those who lived here near the coast had low rates, and those who lived here in the mountains, in the Andes, had very high rates. But they all had gastric cancer, or they all had Helicobacter pylori. And the solution was an intriguing one. What they found was that if you, in the low-risk area, if your Helicobacter pylori was of African ancestry and your genome was similar, you did not get gastric cancer. But if you had a mismatch between your Helicobacter pylori origin, say European, and being of Amerindian ancestry, you had high rates of Helicobacter pylori. So what this study is suggesting is that a mismatch between the genome of the individual and the genome of the Helicobacter led to gastric cancer, suggesting coevolution over time for those with low risk. Now, as we will hear, gastroesophageal reflux is common worldwide, but the clinical expression varies. At the moment, Barrett's and adenocarcinoma are common in the West, but still rare in the East, but this may be changing. And this has implications for assessment, and of course, for the range of effective treatments. Irritable bowel syndrome is a global issue. There's not a lot of data, but everywhere people have looked, it's common. This is a pooled prevalence of all the studies from different parts of the world. And you can see it's common everywhere. Why is this? Does this suggest there's no genetic or environmental contribution to irritable bowel syndrome? Or is it just an artifact that these questionnaires are identifying a common human response to stress or other factors? It's also most common in females who are young adults throughout the world. Why is that? We don't know. Most intriguing is the global prevalence of gastrointestinal cancers. Now, this map shows you the changes in the incidence of gastric cancer between 2005 and 2015. The areas in these shades show increase, very few areas show decrease. So over those 10 years, cancer became more common. However, in most parts of the world, over the same period of time, the mortality from cancer decreased, except in Africa and parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia, probably related to late diagnosis and lack of access to treatment. But you can see from cancer trends that Western cancers are becoming common everywhere. Breast cancer increasing in Latin America, in Asia, Europe, and North America. But we must not forget that around the world, gastrointestinal cancers are extremely common. In fact, collectively, they're the most common group of cancers. But there's some interesting facts here. So if we look at females and compare the more developed regions to the less developed, we will see that colon cancer is now becoming common everywhere. Gastric cancer is mainly a disease of the developing world, as is liver cancer and esophageal cancer, whereas pancreatic cancer is more common in the developed world. The esophageal cancer story is very interesting, and this compares the incidence of adenocarcinoma to squamous cancer in different parts of the world. And you can see that in Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, and Latin America, squamous cancer is still more common, whereas in Europe and North America, adenocarcinoma is more common. And that is shown in this slide of time trends from Australia, United Kingdom, and United States, all of which show this increase in adenocarcinoma of the esophagus. This study from Japan showed a nice relationship between alcohol intake and the incidence of esophageal cancer, which allows me to talk a little bit about alcohol as a risk factor for cancer in general. This is a map of alcohol consumption around the world, and this shows you that in each of those areas, the contribution that alcohol makes to overall mortality. High in Europe, high in Western Pacific region, and you can see the global contribution. It's very significant. But one of the points this article makes is that one of the major contributions of alcohol to mortality is through cancer, almost 14%. This is the map of prevalence of mortality from gastric cancer. You will see much higher in developing regions, while gastric cancer is actually decreasing significantly in the West, in Europe, and North America. Colon cancer, I mentioned, has become common worldwide. And one of the reasons for this is because it's age-related. As populations age, colon cancer becomes more common. Diet is an important factor, and there's a very nice linear relationship between meat consumption in males and females and colon cancer. From a global point of view, there's an interesting point here. In North America, in the US in particular, colon cancer mortality is falling, but it's rising dramatically in Latin America, in Asia, and I could also tell you in Africa. So the global burden of colon cancer is going to increase dramatically. In the US, it has been estimated that some of this decline is a natural phenomenon, but some is attributable to screening and early detection. And this is shown here, looking at one of these large cohorts of polyp follow-up, showing about 50% of the decline in mortality is due to screening. This is going to become an issue for the rest of the world. Now, one thing we forget about is the role of infection in cancer. And this is a very interesting paper that but emphasized the important contribution of infection to cancer. And you can see here the number of cancers in the less developed world which are due to infection: hepatitis B, hepatitis C, Helicobacter pylori, and papillomavirus. And of course, the big one here is liver cancer. It is the third leading cause of cancer death worldwide. Mortality and incidence are almost the same. Really a big problem in Southeast Asia and Africa, but rising elsewhere. And of course, the point is, it's entirely preventable through treatment of hepatitis B, treatment of hepatitis C, and prevention of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I want to mention two other conditions to finish. The first is inflammatory bowel disease. This shows you the prevalence of inflammatory bowel disease throughout the world. Again, a lot of countries with no data, but you can see that at this moment in time, the areas with the highest prevalence are North America, Europe, and Australia. But this is changing, and you can see increases in prevalence in India and also in Latin America. And it has been suggested that Crohn's disease is now replacing tuberculosis as a major gastrointestinal problem throughout the world. Inflammatory bowel disease trends are fascinating. The same trend repeats itself all over the world. In the West, inflammatory bowel disease first began to appear after the Industrial Revolution, and since then has increased dramatically in prevalence. The second thing that has happened in the developed world is that first you see ulcerative colitis, then later you see Crohn's disease, and eventually, now in Europe and North America, the incidence of Crohn's disease and colitis is the same. And this is now happening throughout the world. It's been seen in Russia, in India, and in many other developing countries. There's going to be an increasing burden of inflammatory bowel disease. Celiac disease is very interesting because if you look at the global prevalence of celiac disease, which looks like this, it corresponds directly to the global prevalence of the two haplotypes linked to celiac disease, HLA-DQ2 and DQ8. And you can see that these haplotypes are very common in countries that you wouldn't expect, like India and China and the Middle East. So why don't these countries have a lot of celiac disease? Well, the reason is simple. It's exposure to wheat. And this is changing. In India, already in North India, where people are eating more wheat and bread and Western foods, the incidence of celiac disease is rising. Whereas in South India, where people eat more rice, the incidence remains low. But I predict that celiac disease is going to increase dramatically everywhere that people have the genetic predisposition. So I want to summarize by concluding. Certainly, the global burden of GI disease is tremendous. It's going to keep us all busy for a long time. Despite what you may think, infectious disease remains a significant burden to childhood mortality in the developing world, to cancer development through hepatitis and Helicobacter in the developing world, and to the elderly in the West through C. difficile and other infections. Variations in GI cancer incidence are fascinating, and as I've hinted, they reflect different exposures, perhaps to diet, more westernized, more colon cancer, to infection, more Helicobacter, more gastric cancer, and also to alcohol and tobacco, leading to more esophageal and gastric cancer. Westernization, which is happening all over the world, is leading to progressive changes in disease prevalence. Adenocarcinoma is replacing squamous cancer of the esophagus. Gastric cancer rates are declining, but we're seeing far more colon cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, and celiac disease. The good news, there's tremendous scope for prevention worldwide. But unfortunately, many areas of the world do not have the resources to cope with what is an increasing burden of chronic disease. As we develop, we are replacing infectious diseases which kill children and young adults with chronic diseases that are with us until we're late in life. We need more doctors, more resources, and many parts of the world simply do not have them. Thank you very much for your attention.